Hi, and welcome to the 56th in our series on Middle Eastern and North African Islamic history. And ironically, today, we're not going to be talking about something terribly Islamic. We're going to be talking about Zionism and the mandates of Palestine and Transjordan. Those two mandates are very linked together, and so it makes sense to talk about them together. And the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar or uninitiated, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we will be discussing today. That said, this is a secular presentation, or at least I hope it to be neutral in intent. And I understand that this, like all the other topics in the Middle Eastern history series, is controversial. So let's be respectful. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. What I'd like to say about these presentations is that there are a 101 and a 201, meaning a 101, if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And a 201, there's going to be a lot of additional details that will color this experience, and those will be the next level up in terms of building on what you may already know. I also have a 2-hour hard stop. In fact, I planned that this presentation would extend into next week's presentation. So at 2 hours at 9 p.m. Eastern time, I will stop. That will be the last slide of the presentation, and I'll skip to the question and answer section. I'm more than happy to continue talking about the topics, but I will not introduce any new material. When I put the dates below a person, usually it's years of service, and that's when I'm putting only political figures. But there's a lot of people who are going to be thought leaders in this exercise, and so they didn't hold any particular office. And so when I put dates below them, that's the years of their life. So just sort of, if you have a title and it's a political figure, those are his dates of service, not his lifetime. But if it's a thought leader, you'll see his timeline. And obviously, in many cases, you'll be able to spot the difference because nobody serves politically for 50 years. This is a recording which you can watch later. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can get all the previous 55 episodes of the Middle Eastern History series, as well as this one when it is uploaded. You can also see the rest of our content. As I'll discuss at the end of the presentation, we have a lot of different content, not just the Middle Eastern History series, and we would invite you to see those as well. And if you subscribe, it increases our position on the YouTube algorithm, which is always great for us in terms of recruiting new people to our content. And we also really appreciate PayPal donations. Meetup, Zoom, and YouTube do cost money to maintain at this sort of premium level. And so we appreciate any contributions you feel are necessary. I will put those links in the chat towards the end of our discussion tonight. All right. So I wanted to do a quick reprise of the last 55 or so lessons as concerns the Holy Land, right? As concerns Palestine/Israel. And we talked about, for example, when the Byzantines lost the territory. And the Byzantines lost the territory through a combined invasion of several different Arab armies led by Caliph Omar in 634. With the spectacular victory at the Battle of Yarmouk, which sealed forever the possibility the Byzantines would be able to recover that territory. And in fact, the Byzantine caliphal border stabilized around what's called Ad-Dawahi. You can see that on the map, that sort of white area between the purple of the Byzantine Empire and the green of the caliphal state. And since that point, that territory came under the control of Arab leadership. This is actually the first time that we see the use of the word Palestine, which is the Arab rendering of the Roman Palestina, being used for the territory. In fact, if you look at the map of Muawiyah's governorate, he divides the northern part of what is today Israel and the West Bank into Jund Palestine, or the military occupational territory of Palestine. But we should understand that within the context of the Umayyad Caliphate and the later Abbasid Caliphate, this territory was simply one territory in the larger configuration of the Levant region. So the fact that it had this specific name doesn't mean that the people would identify as belonging to that region with that specific title. I think an important sort of analogy here would be there are a lot of people from different counties within their respective states, but I've never heard of somebody, being a proud Westchestrian or a proud Nassauan, right? If they come from the Westchester or Nassau counties in New York, there's no ethnic or collegial identity that forms around that demarcation of territory, but the name may well be important in terms of creating a locality of place. We also see that when the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates control the territory for over 500 years, they create a policy called Arabization. Now, there's a debate in the historical record and in the public memory as to how explicit Arabization was. That is to say, these policies resulted in people beginning to speak Arabic, beginning to wear Arab clothing, to eat foods that were more inspired by the foods of Arabia, to intermarry to a certain degree with Arabian, especially local women with Arabian men. You see these sorts of things, a more conversion to Islam that occurs in the region. In fact, Palestine, Israel does not become majority Muslim until after the Crusades, which is not dissimilar from most of the other areas that the Arabs conquered in the 600s. Egypt became majority Muslim around the year 900 CE. Iran became majority Muslim in around the year 1000 CE. So the fact that it happened a little bit after the Crusades is not surprising, but it shows the slow rate of conversion and the slow rate of cultural change that is occurring. Religion being one of the last things typically to change in the region. But this, the historical disagreement is to what extent these were imposed laws like this. There were leaders in Damascus and later Baghdad sitting there thinking, how can we make these people more Arab? This is what we're going to do. Very few people believe that that was the approach, but the laws that were created, such as giving increased rights to Muslims, preference to Arabic in spoken and written text, the arrival of militaries from Arabia stationing themselves in these different regions and therefore being in the proximity of local civilians who they would marry and create families with, that these policies ultimately led to the Arabization of the population, which had previously been Roman or Roman identifying. We talked about other occupations that took place in the land of Palestine/Israel. For example, the Fatimids controlled it, and the Fatimids lost it in a number of wars of succession with the Crusader states, resulting in the rise of Saladin. Now, one of the curious things, of course, that people point out is that during the Crusader period, most Jews were expelled from the territory of the Holy Land, and Saladin allowed them to return. There are other differences, such as the Christians who had come in during the Crusader period had less respect for indigenous Christians than they did for those coming from Europe, and so there was this sort of quasi-colonial mentality. But at the same time, as we discussed in our Long Crusade series, to consider it sort of a Western-inspired colonization in the 19th century idea of it sort of misses the point. This was an attack of religious zealots who managed to overpower the local leaders because the local leaders were in dissension. There were a number of wars between the Seljuks of Rome, the Seljuks in the region and the Fatimids. But see the Crusade series if you want 5 hours of in-depth explanation about that. And when the Crusaders were defeated at the Battle of La Fourbi, it really led to a new way of running the territory. You had Hulagu Khan besieging and attacking the region in the 1200s. He was unable to annex it to the Mongol Empire because of the actions of the Egyptian Mamluk, or slave soldier Baibars, who was able to take power in his own right, and then eradicated most of the Crusader states. And in fact, there are many reminders of Baibars in the land of Israel, Palestine today. For example, you can see the Baibars Bridge, which still survives in Lod, which is a city in Israel. You can see a number of other structures that he's built, roads, mosques throughout that land. And then, of course, in 1517, the Mamluk Sultanate is invaded by Sultan Selim the Grim, of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans take direct control of the territory. They win in the Battle of Majd, which takes place in Syria. You can sort of see it on that larger map. It's spelled in Turkish, so Majd is with a C instead of with a J. But after that battle, and the Turkish army was able to proceed all the way to Jerusalem, which is identified, again, this is a map in Turkish as Kudus, before moving into Egypt. And after that territory fell into the Ottoman realm, the Ottomans were willing to allow local individuals to govern different regions. And so you had this sort of squabbling between different noble families who would control territory, expand their power, war against other nobles, form coalitions. And we talked about this in the context of Lebanon, as well as in the context of Palestine. In particular, we have Dahr al-Omar. You can see a picture of him here, and he controls territory in the north of what's Israel and the West Bank today, as well as southern parts of what is today Lebanon. And Dahr al-Omar was an enterprising individual. Many Palestinian nationalists consider him to be the first Palestinian, although, as we're going to discuss with the concept of Palestinianism, he wasn't a person who would have identified with that title. He would have identified as a Sunni Arab, as part of the clans of the Levant region, perhaps a Shami or a Greater Syrian, but the term Palestinian in reference to an ethnic group didn't really exist at this period. Regardless of that, he had as his policy the economic advancement of his territories. And the way he did this was through the facilitation of business. He had two major obstacles to overcome when it came to the growth of the economy in the region. The first was that the security in the region was very light. One of the things that had happened in a lot of areas of the Levant, especially those that were closer to the desert, like many areas in Israel, Palestine are, is that the Bedouin tribesmen would exist on the periphery, and these Bedouin tribesmen would attack the settled people to extort wealth from them. Part of that operation continued for several generations. And what Dahr al-Omar managed to do was that he provided money from the coffers to actually pay off the Bedouin. This would be a tactic that would be used again and again by sedentary leaders following him. But effectively, he paid Bedouin tribes to be his forward guard against the other Bedouin. And by doing this, for example, with the Banu Sakr that you can see on the upper left-hand side, he was able to create almost a military vanguard that would protect his settled communities and allow them to begin to farm in relative security. The other was that there wasn't a lot of wealth to go around. A lot of the wealth was concentrated in these noble clans. And so there were very few lending institutions that were willing to support local industry. So Dahr al-Omar himself wrote credit guarantees, which allowed the banks to begin to lend, especially for the production of cotton, which Dahr al-Omar saw as a cash crop. And Dahr al-Omar also facilitated the immigration of Christians and Jews to the regions he controlled, especially since those Christians primarily coming from Lebanon and those Jews coming from other areas, both of the Islamic world and the Christian world, generally fleeing persecution, brought with them a degree of business acumen that the local population didn't have. This is going to be, of course, a recurring trend that these external populations to the Holy Land are going to have expertise and ability that the local populations don't have in as great of a degree. But at this point, these groups end up building churches and synagogues and end up becoming part of the flourishing community that Dahr al-Omar has created. There's a question here as to whether cotton is still an important industry in Palestine today. I would say no. There's certainly some export of it, but by and large, the cost to make it is one that cannot be matched against significantly larger cotton producers, especially in Southeast Asia. I think I'm trying to remember where they in India as well, where labor is just a lot cheaper and you can have much larger plantations. Cotton also requires a certain amount of water, which if anybody's familiar with modern politics between Israel and Palestine, water is certainly a commodity that is very difficult for Palestinians to acquire, as Israel siphons a significant portion of the fresh water that exists in aquifers throughout the region. We have attempts by Egypt to enter Israel and Palestine, especially during the reign of Ali Bey al-Kabir, and he and Dahr al-Omar create an alliance. Of course, this alliance basically spells the downfall for Dahr al-Omar, because this is seen as insubordination against the Ottoman Empire. But he's not the only foreign invading army that's coming into the territory. The next to come in were the French. The French invaded Egypt, and then once they did, Napoleon set his sights on the taking of Palestine as his next military adventure. He went as far as what is today Lebanon, taking the city of Tyre in 1799. Now, the French forces in this campaign were roughly 2,000 people. So most of these battles are a few hundred people at any given point. But given his advantage militarily, he had much more advanced weapons and much better strategy. He was able to basically conquer everything up to the city of Acre. You can see those upward French arrows in red showing his advance against Selim III, the Ottoman emperor, who was leading through his local vassal, Ahmed Jazar Pasha. And it was only when Napoleon got to Acre that he was defeated, that his forces were just simply too few to take the fortress. And his historic enemy, Antoine de la Picard-Philippot, who had gone to the Ottoman side in order to unseat Napoleon. Technically, he was actually in the British payroll, and the British sent him to liaise with Ahmed Jazar Pasha. But he was able to prepare defenses, knowing Napoleon's traditional techniques, and Napoleon was defeated at the siege. We're actually going to talk about this because of Napoleon's quasi-Zionist aspirations and how they feed into sort of proto-Zionism. But after he loses this battle, Napoleon has to withdraw to Egypt, and he is removed by the British in 1802. That leads to the ascension of Muhammad Ali, which we talked about last week, and his invasion of the Levant. In particular, he took over the territory in the mid-1830s, and his presence in the Levant causes a lot of unrest in Israel-Palestine. And you see attacks on both the Jewish and the Muslim communities. In particular, we have attacks on at the Battle of Hebron, which is an attack on the Jewish community that was there. In that case, in 1834, the local Arabs believed that the Jews were in collaboration with Ibrahim Pasha from Egypt, and so they slaughtered the Jewish community after breaching the city walls and then later the ghetto walls. In the case of Tzfat, it was an attack against it was also an attack against the Jewish population there. In this case, it was led by individuals affiliated with the regime who believed that rebel Arab, with Ibrahim Pasha, because Ibrahim Pasha's forces thought the Jews were collaborating with the rebel Arabs. In both cases, the Jews tried to maintain as much distance as possible. Now, why were the Arabs so opposed to the Egyptian government as opposed to the Ottoman government? Both of these governments were ruled by Turkish families from abroad. Both of these governments had limited ability to impress laws and change long-term policy. The reason is that Ibrahim Pasha, when he arrived, put many of the local Arab population into corvée labor, which is unpaid, effectively slave labor, building up military barracks and garrisons, and they simply did not want to change what the arrangement had been. And in 1840, through the intervention of the great powers, Egypt was forced out of the Levant, and the Ottoman Empire recovered it. In the meantime, in the Ottoman Empire, especially with the Hat Sharif Gülhane in 1839 and with the Hat Humayun in 1856, we begin to see the Ottomanism movement, the movement towards recognizing all the citizens of the Ottoman Empire as equals. One of the things that we had talked about is how in the Ottoman Empire, Muslims had legal superiority to Christians and Jews, who had their own legal representatives in government, but those representatives in government had different rights, lesser rights, perhaps we can say, than the Muslim population. That's not to say that they didn't have other things in which they had more rights than the Muslim population. For example, Christians and Jews could buy and sell alcohol, which Muslim citizens could not, right? So you had things like, but on the contrary, Christians couldn't proselytize and Jews and Christians couldn't have public festivals. So there were these sort of gives and takes, and these were abolished. In the Hat Sharif and the Hat Humayun. Now, I have a question about whether taxation was higher for Jews and Christians than for Muslims. Yes, but not necessarily every person, right? You can sort of imagine a bell curve, right? There were taxes that were assessed on land. So obviously, if you were a Muslim landowner who owned significant portions of land, you would be taxed higher than a Jew who owns nothing. But the jizya or poll tax was a tax that was only assessed against minorities, and the kharaj or the land tax was assessed differently against Muslims and non-Muslims. But again, any individual's personal taxation rate might have been different. But regardless, this Ottomanism movement really changed the way that, at least from a governing perspective, Jews and Christians were to be viewed by the government. In fact, one of the most profound changes is that if a lawsuit occurred between people of two different religious groups, they would be heard in a mixed court. They wouldn't be heard in a Muslim court, right? So the judges would be the judges would be a bench panel. There would be several judges, and they would be representative, usually of Muslim and Christian groups. But in that way, it prevented the traditional miscarriage of justice. However, as we talked about with our discussions on the lead up to the Armenian genocide, many of these courts were still deemed to be unequal, and that the testimonies of non-Muslim subjects were not taken as seriously. There's a question of whether people were permitted to intermarry between religious groups. Intermarriage was permitted, but only permitted as Muslimly acceptable. So this is a case where a Muslim can marry a non-Muslim woman, but the reverse is not permissible. And marriage between people who, between two non-Muslims of differing religions, and remember, in the Ottoman Empire, the different Christianities are different religions. They're not the same religion. So a Catholic Orthodox marriage is not a marriage of the same religion. Those would only be permitted if the leaders of those religions permitted it, which was basically no. There's also an important point to make with Ottomanism, is that Ottomanism in many cases was a top-down political process, as opposed to, for example, civil rights in the United States, which was a bottom-up process. This was legislated by the Sultan on the people, and from people like Mustafa Rashid Pasha, who was the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. And so at a local level, even within areas like Constantinople, which were directly affected by the rules of the Sultan, these rules were not well implemented. Never mind an area as remote as Israel, Palestine, where a lot of these sort of traditional clans continued to rule, and the enforcement mechanisms were simply not there to make these a reality. Another fundamental change that occurred during the Ottoman period is that land was significantly reorganized and reallocated. So you had, right, the creation of what was called Arazi Miri, or state-owned land, and almost all land in the Ottoman Empire was Arazi Miri. The Arazi Miri could be purchased. If it was purchased, then it became Mamluk, or owned land. Mamluk land could be donated to a religious purpose called a waqf, or a land trust, and that became Arazi Mavkuf. You also had types of land that were sort of shared land, things like roads, which was Arazi Matruk, or or partitioned land, I guess you could translate it as. And the last category was Arazi Ma'bat, or Arazi Maut, meaning dead land, meaning land that was that nobody really claimed ownership of, that was sort of useless. And so this Ottoman land code significantly re-established the relationship between many of the peasants and their land, because while most peasants hadn't owned their land, they considered the land theirs. But in this law, it instantiated for the first time that no, the land wasn't theirs, and to the extent it was owned by these clans that had historically registered it. And so that registration became formal and acknowledged, meaning that the majority of people who believed in the Ottoman Empire that they owned land didn't actually own the land that they lived on. They were effectively sharecroppers on it. Now, there's a question as to, in the mixed marriage, how is it decided which religious identity was assigned to the children? In a marriage between Muslims and non-Muslims, the child was Muslim. That was just accepted. In a marriage between people who were non-Muslims, the religious identity followed the identity of the father in most legal documentation. One of the things that we should remember is that in most Middle Eastern countries, even today, religion is not a private choice. Religion is a public membership, in the same way that race is a affiliation in a public membership in the United States. A person can't change their race voluntarily. A person cannot change their religion in the Middle East voluntarily. Conversion is a legal process. Of course, unlike race, which you cannot actually change even through a legal process, religion you can change through a legal process. In Lebanon for today, which is a confessional country, your religion is actually part of your voting permissions and not. There's a point here that the Jews are Ahl al-Dhimma. This is true. Ahl al-Dhimma was abolished with the Hat al-Humayun in 1856, which established those equal rights. But as I said, the enforcement of these laws guaranteeing equal rights was not as clean and as effective as we might think from a 20th century perspective, 21st century perspective. It was enforced through the various prisms of local authority, which was highly decentralized, and through the biases of the various the various elites, most of whom were Muslim and who benefited from the previous unequal relationship. So it wasn't a perfect abolition. The next part that we have to talk about is, and we've alluded to, and we talked about it in episode 27 and in several subsequent episodes, was the Circassian expulsion from Russia. Now, we talked about the genocide in Russia previously, but it's also important to remember that the Circassians found a place to live in the Middle East. And while their numbers weren't significant, their role in history is, because the Circassians were very militant. They had fought the Russians for 50 years when the Russians were trying to expand into the Caucasus region. And so they had built up a historical culture of being effective soldiers. And in many cases, they were placed by the ruling elites in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan today in locations where they would be needed, in much the same way that Dhahr al-Umar had recruited Bedouins to fight against other Bedouins, right? The Circassians now could fight against the Bedouins, and their loyalty would be even more unquestioning than the loyalty of the Bedouins. Because the Circassians owed their entire success and safety to the sovereign that they served. So we just talked about how when the Hat al-Humayun and the Hat al-Sharif Gulhane were passed, that these areas were under the control of different local lords and groups. This would change in 1864 with the Tashkili Vilayat Nizam Namesi, or the National Provincial Reorganization. And that law effectively changed the Ottoman Empire from being a very decentralized empire, where a sultan's control was very closely linked with how far away you were from Constantinople, and at a further distance was much more informed by tribute and other sort of vassal type obligations. to a direct governorate or vilayat system, where the governorate would be divided into subcategories, and those subcategories would all be responsive to the Sultan. New leaders were sent from Constantinople who would directly report, and this, of course, created a lot of friction between Constantinople and regions like Israel, Palestine, which were at the edge of Ottoman control. And this resulted in a number of revolts. One of these revolts was economic, as the construction of the railroads that would link this region, like the Hijaz Railroad, were being built. You had revolts from lower classes that felt that the sultans were not effectively protecting them from the Bedouins. And so you had the intervention both of Circassians and of Druze to try and tamp down these revolts, and the peasants requiring more and more compensation. Now, that's not like they were starting with much. The peasants were being given about 1/8 the results of their sharecropping. So one of the things that we're going to see, and it's a consistent trend throughout the Levant region in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is that you're going to have a land-owning class that is ethnically or religiously or socially different from the class that's living on the land and acting on the land, and that's going to cause resentment between these two groups. In this case, in the region of Hauran, in what's today southwestern Syria, the conflict is between Muslim and Christian Arabs. On the one hand, the landowners being Druze, Arabs on the other, and on the third side, we have the Bedouins who are stealing from these sharecroppers because they're easy targets. We talked also that there was the Nahda, or Renaissance, that occurred in the late 19th and early 20th century, where two different ideological positions began to crystallize. You had Islamic modernism, which we talked about a lot in our discussion of Egypt and our discussion of Iran, and Syrian nationalism, whose first progenitor, Georgi Zaidan, we talked about a bit when we talked about the French Levant. And in the question of Palestine, Islamic modernists play an almost non-existent role. It's Syrian nationalism that becomes dominant in that region. And we should be clear that when we're talking about Syria in this context, we're talking about Greater Syria, or the entire Levant region, Bilad al-Sham, which you can see on that map includes Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. All those areas were assumed by the Syrian nationalists to be a part of one larger state. And there were distinctions between different philosophers as to how that would look. We talked we talked in episode 54 about how Boutros al-Bustani believed that this would be a population that would be united through a literate, cultivated tradition, speaking fluent modern standard Arabic. And you had leaders of this, like the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, Anton Saadeh. Both these individuals, by the way, are Christian. Boutros al-Bustani was Catholic and he converted to being Protestant. Anton Saadeh was Greek Orthodox. And he was the leader of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, which was also based in Lebanon. And he argued that no, in fact, the language of Sham, of the Levant, should be a form of Syrian Arabic in order to reflect the culture of the people there. They saw themselves as somehow distinct from the other Arab populations. They also saw themselves as a little bit more educated than other Arab populations. Many individuals from the region had studied abroad in the US, Canada, or Europe. A number of other individuals had built schools, or because of the influx of Christian and Jewish missionaries responding to Christian and Jewish groups on the ground. There were a number of schools that existed in Greater Syria that didn't exist in other places in the Arab world. And so there was this sort of sense that there was a commonality of culture throughout the Levant, and that should be the genesis of a Levantine or Shami state. So now that we've sort of set up the Middle East in terms of where we are at the end of the 19th century, I want to get the Jews to the same place. So one of the most common questions that sort of crops up when you study the development of Zionism and the development of the State of Israel is, why is it the case that we don't have a Jewish polity in the Middle East from about 135 CE until the 20th century, right? That there's really no major action by the Jews to create some sort of militant force. And it's not that Jews didn't have a history of creating militant forces. There were 4 Roman-Jewish wars, and the zealots who fought in those wars were incredibly ferocious in their and zealous in their attempt to create a Jewish state. So this really is a development that comes out of the rabbinic period, and the rabbis try to understand in their own context how it was that the Jews could not prevail against the Romans, right? Because in theory, if the Jews have God on their side, it should be the case that they should be able to prevail. Now, what the rabbis end up discovering, and it's most clearly enunciated around the year 1000 by Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, known to most religious Jews as Rashi, is that there was a ban on creating a Jewish state, and that God had seen that the sins of the Jewish people were too great to permit them to return. And those sins were what led to the destruction of the great Jewish temple and the failure of those Jewish militaries to prevail. This view of God abandoning the Jews in that sort of way, not that he'd abandoned them completely, but that he'd abandoned them to the right of having a political polity, was encapsulated by a number of different songs that developed in the Jewish culture and liturgy. One of them in particular is part of the book of Psalms. There's a line, Im Hashem lo yivneh bayit, right? If God does not build a house. And the meaning of this song is that if God doesn't build a house, then there's no way to protect it from demolition, right? Which is a reference to the possibility of these Jewish states coming into existence. These Jewish states are coming into existence against the divine will. And that picture is actually from a very famous YouTube rendition of that song that has, at this point, I think 24 million views. But the ban on resettlement goes like this, right? The Jews cannot return collectively to Israel by physical force, and that they can't rebel against the various nations of the world in which they are living, right, in this new diasporic condition. Also, Jews have no right to force the Messiah to come. They have no right to force the apocalypse to happen. And conversely, God made an agreement with the nations of the world that they can't treat the Jews too harshly, that they have to protect them to a certain degree, and that the Jewish people would have to wait for the Messiah to bring about a Jewish state, to bring about the end of the world, and that would be the time at which Jews could come back and create a state. And so this theological ban on resettlement was the dominant view in the Jewish world until the 19th century. Now, there are exceptions to this perspective, and so we're going to address them here. So the first major exception to this perspective chronologically is Shabbatai Tzvi. There are a number of messianic candidates that have occurred in Judaism. Jesus was not the first, nor was he the last of these messianic candidates. The only difference is that he is the only one who has a religion that venerates him to this day. So one of these messianic candidates was Shabbatai Tzvi. He lived in the Ottoman Empire, close to the region of close to Constantinople. He moved on both sides of the Europe-Asia territory, but he stayed generally in that area. And he claimed that he was the Messiah. And as part of his job, right, as the Messiah, he would resurrect the state of Israel. And so many Jews moved to the land of Israel in order to settle there, in the assumption that he was going to end the current system. Now, when the Ottoman authorities captured him, because they believed that he was going to instigate a rebellion in the land of Israel with all of those newly moved peasants, he was charged either that he should be executed or he would have to convert to Islam in order to prevent this reality from occurring. And he chose conversion, which effectively dispelled his ability to claim that he was indeed the Messiah. And with the Jewish world's acknowledgement that he was no longer the Messiah, the hope of resurrecting the Jewish state and moving past the theological ban on resettlement, died with him. It's worth pointing out that Shabtai Tzvi had incredible pull in the Jewish community. His claim to be a Messiah was causing a near civil war in the Jewish world, and many of the Jews who had come down to the end of Israel in order to settle it were individuals from Poland, from Germany. These were not individuals from the Ottoman Empire. That was the pull of his message, and that's how effective he was. Another point of how effective he was is that there's still a Turkish Muslim population today called the Dunme who converted to Islam with Shabtai Tzvi, believing that his way of bringing about the end was conversion to Islam. And so he would destroy Islam from within and therefore bring about the end of days. And after they converted, their descendants stayed converted. And because of this sort of crypto-Jewish origin, many Muslims today are very traditionally skeptical of Dunme's commitment to Islam, even though the Dunme of today are not their ancestors and have no affiliation with Judaism. On the other rabbinical side, you have Tzvi Kalisher and Yehuda Alkalai. Tzvi Kalisher was an Ashkenazi Jew, and Yehuda Alkalai a Sephardi Jew. Both of these individuals argued that it was important in order to bring about the Messiah that Jewish populations begin to move to the land of Israel. Yehuda Alkalai argued that there was a magical time between the years of 1840 and 1939, these 100 years, that would see the flourishing of a Jewish people in the land of Israel and would lead to the eventual creation of a Jewish polity there. But both of these rabbis had vociferous debate and argument with other rabbis as to the validity of these perspectives. And it's worth pointing out that these three Jewish perspectives are all fundamentally based on a theological, on a religiously Jewish understanding of the theological ban on resettlement, right? Shabtai Tzvi is arguing from the position of he is the Messiah, therefore he can permit it, and Tzvi Kalisher and Yehuda Alkalai are arguing that we are already in the end times. That's why we need to settle there, because the Messiah is on his way. It is happening. Now, the other three perspectives that I'm going to present are Christian perspectives. So probably the first Zionist or proto-Zionist, perhaps from the Christian side, would be Napoleon himself. As we talked about at the Siege of Acre, while he was there, he had been in consultation with numerous Jewish individuals, and he believed that a resurrection of the Jewish people in their traditional homeland would be part of his goal of civilizing the world and being the emperor, the true emperor of Europe and the world, which he would eventually aspire to become. So as part of that civilizing mission, if he won at the Battle of Acre, he was prepared to give a speech where he would allocate the territories that he had conquered in Israel/Palestine to the Jewish people and permit their return, seeing himself in a certain way like Cyrus the Great. You also had individuals like Herbert Aldersmith. He was a British Christian, and he was one of the leading founders of the British Israelism movement. This was a movement among evangelical Protestants in the UK. And this was a movement that saw the British people as one of the 10 lost tribes. It's based on, most historians argue that the historicity of such a claim is between ridiculous and fanciful. But this was a prominent movement up until the 1940s, and the church still exists today, the British Israelite Church. Because of this claim that these were part of the 10 lost tribes, there was a degree of proto-Zionism that existed among their membership, arguing that they should help their fellow Jewish kindred in terms of their goals and aspirations to create a Jewish state. There were also some anti-Semitic elements within the British Israelite movement, arguing that that the Jews unfairly have taken too much of the mantle of being the descendants of the Israelites. And so creating a Jewish state would be in the interest of the British Israelites, because that would get the Jews out of Britain and into that state. You also see the views of Christian Zionists like Anthony Ashley Cooper begin to develop. And we see this view reflected in a lot of American evangelical Protestants as well, which is the idea that God has ordained the land of Israel to the Jewish people. And therefore, in order for Christians to receive the blessing of God, they should work to fulfill God's will and create that population in the land. So all of these movements existed throughout pre-Zionistic history that were advocating for some kind of Jewish presence in the Holy Land and the creation from that a political polity. But none of these individuals or none of these viewpoints really have assimilated into what is Zionism. So we're going to talk about how that came into existence. So Zionism is directly a result of the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment. And the Haskalah was the result of modernity affecting the Jewish people. And modernity, especially in a European context, because modernity doesn't hit the Middle East until the 19th century. But in Europe, it happens as early as the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Part of this enlightenment is that Jews get involved in the secular sciences. You can see Shlomo del Mendico's Sefer Elim, or the Book of Science, where he goes through a number of mechanical and mathematical calculations. You also see a massive development in the ideological sphere because of the debate of what's called Judenfrage, or the Jewish question. So this Jewish question starts being debated about 400 years ago in Germany. And it's hard to argue exactly when it started, but probably two of the most famous progenitors of the debate were Rabbi Moses Mendelssohn and Johann Caspar Lavater in the 18th century, although, as I said, the debate had been going on before. Mendelssohn and Lavater were good friends. Mendelssohn was an Orthodox Jew. Lavater was a Christian. At that time, many Christians covered their head as well. So he's actually, so that's that he's not trying to appropriate Jewish headwear. Now, they were friends, but they also disagreed about the role of Jews in society. And the question underlying Judenfrage, or the Jewish question, was, is it possible for Jews to be part of European society as full Europeans? Can they partake of our culture? Are they going to be individuals who are going to be loyal to the countries in which they sit? Are they going to be people whose understanding of God we understand that it's different. Is it similar enough that their values will match? All these kinds of questions. And for people for whom that seems like a ridiculous question, Jews are of course well assimilated in Western society today. We could think in the way of Muslimenfrage, or the Muslim question in today's society, right? Because people do ask these same kinds of questions of Muslims in the West. Do they have allegiance to Western values? Do they want the same things Westerners want? And there may well be very different answers to those questions. But that was what the press in the German-speaking world was debating. And the German-speaking world was distinct from places like France and Britain, where the population of Jews was very small, and therefore they didn't have a very clear public voice. And regions like Russia, where despite having a large Jewish population, that population was not literate and not able to access the means of ideological dissemination. So in the German-speaking world, there were enough Jews and Jews who were literate in the sense of the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment, in order to engage on this. And there were a lot of different responses from German leaders. Some of them said that as German leaders, politicos, philosophers, and Jewish individuals on the other side, some were saying that Jews couldn't be integrated in any way. So, believing ideas such as racial anti-Semitism, right? That Jews are fundamentally a different kind of being. And the same way that you couldn't expect to have a successful society with humans and chimpanzees, you couldn't expect to have something similar with Jews. There were other opinions, on the very other side of the spectrum that said that there was no distinction between Jews and European Christians, and they should live harmoniously. There were those who said that perhaps Jews should assimilate more, and then they would be acceptable. Perhaps they would have to give up their religion, but maybe they could keep their clothing. Maybe they could keep their clothing, but lose their clothing, but keep their religion. all different kinds of things. And there was a massive rate of change within communities. So you have, in fact, in single families, you have change occurring very quickly. And you can see from this postcard from Austria, you have a grandfather who's in the traditional dress that Jews would wear in the shtetls, in the small closed-off Jewish townships that littered the Polish landscape. And you had their children who were dressed in typical Austrian clothing. And literally in one generation, you would have this sort of jarring shift within the Jewish population as more and more people, more and more Jews decided that perhaps some degree of assimilation was possible. And Europeans on the other side thought perhaps some degree of acceptability for Jews, even though there were a number of restrictive laws and covenants throughout Europe. Some of those might be able to be repealed. And we'll talk about some of that when we talk about integrationism. And one of the most interesting parts of the Haskalah was the creation of the modern Hebrew language. The language that's spoken in Israel today is a creation. Now, that's not to say that Hebrew doesn't exist independent of this, right? The Bible was certainly written in biblical Hebrew, and there was a medieval Hebrew that rabbis used to correspond with one another. But the modern language required significantly more verbs than existed in the biblical period because of things that we do now that we didn't do then. Significantly more words to describe phenomena that we didn't have. And it had no native speakers. So Eliezer ben Yehuda literally scraped the entire Bible to find as much vocab as he could. And he assembled a new syntax that sort of matched verb, subject, object order that a lot of people are used to, right? The same way that we say in English, I ate dinner. You don't say I dinner, which is the traditional biblical Hebrew order of the words. He added a number of other different pieces, and his children were the first native speakers of Hebrew, which also meant that they couldn't speak to anybody else except their own parents until they learned a second language. So there's a serious question there as to, you know, how salutary that is. But there's a question here about how many Jews were in Iraq. There were about 140,000, 170,000, depends on how you count them, Jews in Iraq in 1940. Today, in the Kurdish region, there might be 1,000. Outside of the Kurdish region, it's in the single digits. You begin to develop, as part of this Haskalah, as part of this Jewish Enlightenment, a desire to connect with Israel. And that desire begins to transcend the typical religious view of Israel being conceptual, in Israel being a place in the future, to a place that they want to actually access. And so Leon Pinsker begins to found a movement called the Chovevei Zion, the Lovers of Zion. The Lovers of Zion. And that group began to facilitate more and more literary attention to the land of Israel. He was publishing in Odessa, which was a city known for having large minority populations. It was a Russian-speaking city. It was certainly part of the Russian Empire, but it had a significant population of Romanian speakers, Ukrainians, and other people from other parts of the Black Sea world. And so Jews were disproportionately represented there. His views became increasingly popular, and it spawned a desire to migrate for a small population, probably around about 10,000 people, to migrate to Ottoman Palestine and found small settlements. Of course, they needed money in order to do so, and this is where the Rothschild family came into existence. Baron Edmund de Rothschild was willing to financially support these initial settlers in the land, and you can see in black a number of the settlements that they created. One of the things that a lot of these people encountered when they arrived is that they had been trained in Europe as economists, as bankers, lawyers, doctors. I mean, there's a reason the stereotype exists. And so you had this disproportionate group of white-collar Jews moving to a land that was effectively only agricultural. And so it turns out that You may be fantastic as a banker, you might be pitiful as a farmer, and half of them ended up returning to Europe. What ended up saving the remaining half was not some magical intuition about how to farm. It was the fact that a lot of Yemenites had believed, similar to Yehuda al-Kalai, that the end times were coming and that they should make a migration on foot from Yemen across what is now Saudi Arabia to Israel in order to begin supporting the Messiah who would come. And so these Yemenites became one of the leading anchors to the new European Jewish population that was moving in, because they were able to teach them more effective farming techniques. And Europeans at this time began to rely as well on local Arab falahin, or local Arab peasants, to help them in the process of farming. Now, I have a point that there were also a lot of compelling push factors for Jews to leave, such as the pogroms in Russia and the assassination of Tsar Alexander I, which, while not committed by the Jews, was often blamed on them. There's another question as to, when I say that Eliezer ben Yehuda scrubbed the entire Bible, I'm referring to the Old Testament, and in fact, not even the entire Old Testament. There are parts of the Old Testament that are written in Aramaic, so he couldn't use those parts. The New Testament would not be useful, since the New Testament doesn't exist in Hebrew, or at least it's not the original iteration of the New Testament. The New Testament was written in Koine, which is Greek, a form of Greek. So he could only use those parts of the Bible that were in Hebrew. He also used some rabbinic literature that was in Hebrew, but by and large, because the rabbinic literature began to have different kinds of grammar than existed in the Bible, he wanted to use just one stratum. Now, we then have the actual creation of the Zionist movement itself, right? So these things that have happened before are sort of on the path, right? Chovevei Tzion, the lovers of Zion, definitely has some emotional connection to Zionism, but it's not the concept of creating a polity. At no point, at least as far as I'm familiar, did Leon Pinsker ever say that he wanted to create a state for Jews. And that changes with an Austrian journalist named Theodor Herzl. Herzl comes from a secular Jewish family. His family is heavily inspired by the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. You would be very surprised to see him in a synagogue, but he definitely still considered himself a Jew, and he pinned his hopes for the future of Jewish integration into Europe with the increasing perception of Jews being Europeans. And he looked towards France and the UK as being the most, as being the forerunning countries in this, the most civilized countries, the most pro-Jewish countries. And accordingly, the moment that shook his faith in this was the Dreyfus Affair. So it's worth sort of pointing out a little bit about what this is. France went into a war with Germany in 1870 to 1871. That's called the Franco-Prussian War, and the French lost that war badly. In fact, they lost it so badly, they had a revolution and a regime change. But one of the reasons that they lost the war, among many, was that a general named Esterhazy had slipped information to the Germans as a covert spy. There is debate about whether or not the French leadership knew that Esterhazy was responsible, or they just knew that it wasn't Alfred Dreyfus, but they knew that Dreyfus was innocent of the crime of espionage. Despite that, they had a kangaroo court and accused him of betraying the Second French Empire. And it was quite clear from most in the French press, regardless of whether you supported or opposed the court-martial, that the court-martial was due to Dreyfus being a Jew. And as you can see there, they broke his sword, which is the symbol of a court-martial. And he was imprisoned in French Guiana in South America, on a place called Devil's Island, which has one of the worst bouts of tropical disease probably anywhere in the world. The trial of Alfred Dreyfus, although condemned by liberal French, like Émile Zola in his famous letter J'accuse, made Herzl believe that the possibility of integration was a foregone conclusion in the negative, that Jews could never be part of European society, that Judenfrage had an answer. The answer was no. Jews could not be part of the European experiment. And so immediately after the Alfred Dreyfus affair, he writes Der Judenstaat, which is means the Jewish state, and it and you can see in the subtitle, Versuch modernen Lösung der Judenfrage, in search of a modern solution to the Jewish question, right? So he's literally responding to this Jewish question. For those who are familiar with the Holocaust, Hitler, right, also says Entlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution to the Jewish question, when he talks about the Holocaust and the genocide that he was going to perpetrate. So you can see this engagement with the debate. Obviously, these are two very different solutions, but Herzl's solution is the creation of a Jewish polity. Now, many aspects of the Jewish polity he wants to describe are not at all reminiscent of what we think of when we see Israel today. He believed that the official language should be German, since there would be no more civilized language. Obviously, after the events of World War II, that was shelved. He argued that the Jewish state could be anywhere in the world. And when the World Zionist Congresses would debate, they would debate different possibilities, Uganda, Madagascar, but any individuals within the Jewish world were much more finicky about where it should be than he was. And there were other different issues. He wrote a second book in 1902 called Alt Neuland, or Old New Country. And this book became the inspiration for how to revive Jewish culture and society in a post-religious context, because Theodor Herzl knew after the court-martial of Alfred Dreyfus that he was irrevocably a Jew, but without religion, what did that mean? And so how would Jewish culture exist outside of the religion, and how could that manifest in the form of a political organization? And so Alt Neuland talks about these kinds of concepts. In Hebrew, the book was translated as Tel Aviv, which became the name of a new settlement that was built 4 years later on the outskirts of Jaffa, and is now the largest city in Israel. So Theodor Herzl, in his desire to create a Jewish homeland, approaches Sultan Abdul Hamid II in this very accurate picture that was not taken from a conspiracy website. And in that picture, he offers about 20 million pounds sterling that would be supported by a number of different Jewish bankers. That actually is true. And he argues that Abdul Hamid II should cede him a significant portion of land in what is today Israel, in order to create a Jewish polity there. And Abdul Hamid's response was quite famous. He didn't respond to Herzl himself. He was talking to a different member in the Zionist entourage. Advised Mr. Herzl not to take another step in this matter. I cannot sell even a foot of land, for it does not belong to me, but to the Ummah, the Muslim people, the Muslim nation. The Ummah have won this empire by fighting for it with their blood, and have fertilized it with their blood. We will again cover it with our blood before we allow it to be wrested away from us. And this has often been taken as sort of a defense of, we're going to fight for our land. We don't need your money, despite the fact that Abdul Hamid II absolutely needed that money. His government was in massive debt after the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, and a number of his modernization projects. But he refused to give away territory. And because of these sorts of actions, you begin to create modern Turkish anti-Semitism, which I discussed a little bit in some of the previous episodes. I think episode 50 and maybe 48. That said, a number of Jews very quickly distanced themselves from what Herzl was doing. Max Nordau and the majority of the Zionist Congress argued that there should be some agreement with the Turks, but that what Herzl was doing was beyond insulting. So during the 19th century, and the beginning of the 20th century, there was a majority of the Jewish world operating in opposition to Zionism. Zionism was a minority movement. Of course, with the success of Israel today, Zionism has become a political position embraced by most Jews and in fact by many non-Jews as well. But it was not always the case. And so in the 19th century, you had Jews who were trying to pursue a lot of different paths. Probably the most dominant path was the Orthodox traditional path. Chaim Elazar Spira and Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, you can see those two rabbis there, as well as the Agudat Yisrael, which is a rabbinical authority that operates in a number of Ashkenazi Jewish communities. All of these groups held to the traditional theological ban on resettlement and argued that the Zionists were secular individuals who had lost touch with what Judaism actually stands for and were trying to build something that had no Jewish context to it. You had the integrationists like Heine and Gabriel Risa. Now, Heine converted to Christianity at a young age. He converted to Lutheranism at an older age, both in the attempt to become more established. He's a very famous poet and writer and humanist. Gabriel Risa moved to Hamburg, and despite being legally certified as a lawyer in some districts of Germany and Hamburg, he was not permitted to serve as a lawyer because of his Jewish identity, and he was not allowed to become a citizen of the city, which most Hamburg residents weren't, by the way, but he wasn't allowed to become a citizen of the city because of his Jewish ethnicity and religion. That said, when the laws changed in Hamburg, he reapplied and became first a secretary working in the city, a legal secretary working in the city, and then eventually he became part of the Bürgerschaft, or the town hall, where he represented part of the community. He was usually the only Jew in attendance, but he fought very strongly for what's called Jewish emancipation, the idea that Jews should have the same legal and social rights that non-Jews would have, and that way they could integrate into larger society. So you had sort of two veins of how integrationism worked. You had sort of Heine's route of actually converting to Christianity and trying to live in the Christian world, and Gabriel Risa's route of trying to promote Jewish emancipation, that Jews should have the same rights as non-Jews. And by the beginning of the 20th century, most European countries west of Poland had given a certain degree of Jewish emancipation, if not full Jewish emancipation. You, of course, had situations, for example, like Benjamin Disraeli in the UK, where he had to convert to Anglicanism in order to serve as an MP, which is sort of more on the Heine side. But you also had voting by French Jews in the Third Republic. So you have these different situations. In fact, in Algeria, Algerian Jews had French citizenship while Algerian Muslims did not, as a result of the Crémieux Decree, because Crémieux in 1840 was a Jewish minister in the French government. You also had, in Eastern Europe, you had the autonomists. Probably the most famous of these is Simon Dubnov. And the autonomy was a common policy discussed in Tsarist Russia in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And it was the idea that different ethnic groups should have an autonomous region where they can proliferate and practice customs that might be slightly different or slightly unacceptable to the Russian majority within the empire. And this view still holds today in parts of Russia, right? You have different autonomous regions. One particular example is Yakutia or Sakha region in northeastern Russia, which is designed to be the homeland of the Sakha people. And so Simon Dubnov argued that there should be an autonomous Jewish region within the larger Russian Tsardom, and that would be the way of accommodating Judaism, is that Jews could have some degree of political independence without full-blown nationhood. And the final view that was in opposition to Zionism were the Bundists, who argued that going to another country wasn't the solution. The solution was to bring socialism, because in a socialist state, the divisions between people of different religions would evaporate, because the recognition would be that all workers are the same, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of religion, regardless of prior class standing. They would come together. And so the Bundists were very popular in both Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and the Americas. A number of socialist newspapers still exist that were founded by the Bundists. One particular one in New York is called The Forward. Obviously, its ridership has changed in the intervening decades as Bundism has basically disappeared from the Jewish political scene. But these four camps really stood in massive opposition to Zionism, either from the argument that it's not theologically valid, that Jews had a position that they could survive in Europe, that Jews had a way, perhaps within the European context, of being autonomous to a certain degree and therefore retaining their traditions, or that what was more important was creating a socialist revolution than creating a new polity. There's a question of asking, is Disraeli, of whom it was that he would have been a better PM if he'd not been such a good Jew? I think that is him, yes. Don't quote me on that. So Herzl and a number of other Zionists convened a council in Basel in 1898, and they received members from over 30 different countries in order to discuss the possibility of creating a Jewish state and what that would look like. Some of the members came from remote delegations. For example, you have Jews from what is today Azerbaijan. Those are the Kafkazi Jews, and you can see Herzl sitting with them. And they would discuss, for example, how the funds would be allocated to promote the settlement and colonization of the region, what the goals would be of the Jews when they got there, what such a political polity would look like, all these different kinds of questions. And this resulted in what was called the second Aliyah, or the second migration to Israel. And that second Aliyah resulted in the construction of a number of kibbutzim, or socialist communes. These kibbutzim were founded in this period, were supposed to be self-sufficient, although, again, we have the same problem of these chalutzim, or Jewish pioneers, coming from mostly white-collar backgrounds and being in the position where they are supposed to be farmers, and they don't know enough to do that. So as we're going to see, there's going to be a degree of outreach to other populations in the region in order to make these places self-sufficient. That said, the kibbutzim are probably the closest manifestation to actual communism, as Marxists would argue it should be, than any large state structure. You have communal ownership of all property within the kibbutz. Children are all raised in one creche. They're not singled out into family units. Education is done by some members of the kibbutz. Other members would do the tasks like the agriculture and make the things that would be sold. Decisions were made by committee. And you sort of had an abolition of the family and equal sharing of resources. It's worth pointing out that as Israel has become more and more capitalist in its economic structure, more and more kibbutzim have become moshavim, or settlements, and these settlements, different word from the settlements in the West Bank. And these settlements are more capitalist and do have families and are reorganized more on the lines of a gated community. But there are still one or two kibbutzim in Israel that still practice this sort of highly socialistic behavior. I also wanted to point out sort of the United States, because there's this sort of view that the United States is a stronghold of Zionism, and today that may well be, that's a relatively accurate case. Certainly, there are more Zionists in the United States than there are in Europe, and most of those Zionists are, of course, evangelical Christians. And by the way, Zionist is simply a person who believes in the legitimacy of a Jewish self-government. There are some who debate whether or not it requires that government be the Israeli government, or it can be anywhere in the world. But that's what a Zionist is. And so I sort of wanted to point out what Americans were thinking about Zionism during this earlier period. Hollywood was disproportionately Jewish even at its inception. In fact, the reason for Hollywood's breakout success was that many Jews were legally banned in the United States from working in the radio industry, and so they decided to, throw their efforts behind filmmaking, which turned out to be more effective than radio anyway. So Hollywood, as I'm pointing out, was actually dominated by Jews. I think 60% of directors in the 1920s were Jews, despite Jews being roughly 1.5% of the US population at the time. And despite this, we don't see a single Hollywood movie from this time that discusses anything connected to the Middle East or Jewish presence there. Hollywood stays extremely apolitical on the Middle East situation during this entire period. And the American population at large had harbored a number of anti-Semitic attitudes, not dissimilar from the European context. And there were laws in the United States that were anti-Semitic in both their intent and interpretation. Some of them, for example, you could covenant land to not fall into Jewish hands. For example, if you sold a property, you could say this property cannot be sold to blacks or Jews, right? And that would be legally binding. So the views on Zionism really begin to change in the American context because of two individuals, Louis Brandeis and Jacob Schiff. Brandeis is a justice first in New York, and then he makes his way, first in Kentucky, and then he makes his way onto the US Supreme Court as an associate justice. While he's there, he's convinced to support the validity of Zionism. And he begins to promote it in a wider American context, seeing it as going hand in hand with American values, that Jewish values and American values are resembling each other, and therefore it's a natural inclination for Americans to support the Jewish desire for self-determination. And then you have Jacob Schiff, who was a businessman. He had made significant amounts of money on Wall Street. He's also famous for raising about 50% of the war bonds that the Japanese used in their defeat of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. But probably his greatest contribution in terms of Zionism was that he was one of the leading founders of the American Jewish Committee, which was an organization, and still exists, whose primary goal and motivation is to promote the survival of the Jewish people, both internal to Israel and external from Israel, in a political sense. They go as far as calling themselves the State Department of the Jewish people. And Jacob Schiff's view was to create political advocacy for Judaism in sort of a quasi-Zionist context, for which he is largely successful. All right. Now, within the territory of Ottoman Palestine, we have this creation of cultural Zionism, and you have it coming from Europeans as well. Ahad Ha'am is one person that I would talk about who discusses this. And cultural Zionism, especially in Ahad Ha'am's view, was this idea that Jewish culture has been limited by the fact they've lived in a diaspora, that that their cultural interaction is a reflection and a reinterpretation of the dominant culture in which they sit. So instead of having Jews reflecting German culture and Jews reflecting French culture, Jews should be in their own historical land, because interacting with other Jews and that land will give them a uniquely Jewish culture, a culture that's truly reminiscent of who they are. And as part of his culturizing mission, he took the name Ahad Ha'am, meaning one of the people, to refer to his position within the creation of a cultural mosaic. Within the territory of Ottoman Palestine itself, we have a number of other perspectives on what cultural Zionism means. You have Albert Abraham Antebi. He was an Ottoman official. He was born in Damascus, Jewish by birth and by ancestry. In fact, his family was from a long line of Syrian Jews of note. And he worked in the Ottoman Empire as a financier and as a lawyer. He spoke 4 different languages. In fact, he studied abroad in France, so his French was probably better than his English. But he was adamant in creating an economic Zionism, where Jews who would come to the land could bring economic resources, skills, abilities to improve the lives of all people in the region. He was vocally against political Zionism. He believed that the way that the Jewish people should affect change is within an Ottoman context, that they shouldn't declare an independent state, that they shouldn't be trying to create fights of nationality against nationality. They should integrate to the Ottoman structure, which was much more accepting of people of different backgrounds, at least from his perspective, people of different backgrounds, people of different religions, instead of creating an us versus them power dynamic. You also have Nissim Yaakov Malul. He was from a Tunisian family, but he was born in the city of Sfat in northern Israel today. And because he moved to Cairo at a young age and studied at the University of Cairo, his literary Arabic was very high level. He also spoke Hebrew and English. And he worked on a number of newspapers that tried to bridge the gap between the Arab and Jewish inhabitants, both indigenous Jews called the Old Yishuv and Jews from Europe, the New Yishuv, tried to bridge that gap in understanding. So on the Arab side, he argued that first of all, he translated a number of Arab objections to Zionism into Hebrew and English, so that way Jews who couldn't understand Arabic would understand these objections and perhaps better respond to them. But he responded to the Arabs, arguing that Zionism would bring to the land a number of accomplished people that could work in tandem with the Arabs, that they could build a culture together. On the flip side, he argued to the Zionists coming from Europe that learning Arabic was essential to becoming part of the Zionist project, that the Zionist project should include all of the peoples of the land of Palestine, not just the Jews, and that the fusion of these peoples is really what would create the best possibility of long-term survival for a Jewish polity in the region. So we have to sort of address what is a Palestinian and how does that happen? Because today there is the concept of the Arab Palestinian, somebody who comes from the territory controlled by the British Mandate of Palestine in 1948, and anybody who's descended therefrom. But that's not necessarily the view that existed historically, right? And so we have to talk about Palestinianism. When did people start considering themselves Palestinian? The first modern usage of the term dates from 1898. Khalil Beidas was translating a book written in Russian about the Holy Land. He was an avid Russophile. He spent years in St. Petersburg, and he actually ran the Russian Orthodox delegations in Palestine, but that's an entirely separate issue. But he was translating a book from Russian on the Holy Land, and he translated the Arab population of Palestine as Philistini or Palestinian. Now, individuals like Baidas, his view on the subject wasn't the dominant view of the population. It simply was the first time that it was used. But the term began to get more and more currency as more and more local people began to use it to refer to themselves. Probably the first real clear use and demonstration that it was popular in the local lexicon was the founder of the Palestine newspaper in 1911, and that newspaper, along with the later newspaper Karim, began to codify the views of the Falah or Arab farmers who existed in that region. Now, if we remember, when we talked earlier, we talked about the settled Arabs and the Bedouin, and the Bedouin were never courted by the people who identified as Philistini to be Palestinian until much later in history. So when we talk about Palestinians, we're only talking about the settled Arabs, the Fellahin. And what made creating a new identity very difficult is that there's nothing, at least at this point, that unifies Palestinians in a way that it doesn't unify all the people up and down the Levant coast. So as you can see, the dialects of Levantine Arabic exist regardless of the current modern day borders, and those dialects occur across the different countries, and it's one of those situations where if you literally could go town to town, you would hear people speaking differently in every single town, the same way that you can, for example, in regions of England, right? If you go to the Midlands, you'll go from town to town and people will speak slightly differently. That's not to say that they don't all speak English. They do, but they might use a different word here or there. Or they might pronounce their letter R's differently, or they might do something that indicates they're speaking a slightly different dialect. And that's what you see throughout the region of Bilad Hashem, right? The greater Syrian region. They also have dances and foods that are common throughout the region. Like Debke exists all through the Levantine coast. Lebanese do it, Syrian coastal do it. So it was hard for the development of an identity that was uniquely Palestinian, exclusive of those other nationalities. That's not to say that they didn't identify as Syrian. They absolutely did. There's a question as to whether the term Palestine connects to the term Philistine. And yes, it does, but indirectly, right? When the Romans named the territory as Palestina, they were using Philistine as an influence to try and eradicate the Jewish history of the region. They thought by renaming it, they could remove that history and remove the incentive for Jews to want to take power again after those 4 incredibly difficult Jewish wars. The Arabs under the when the Arabs conquered it under Caliph Omar, as we talked about in the beginning, he established that the area would be called Philistine because it was still the Byzantine promise of Palestina. And so that Philistine became this Philistine. One of the things that's worth pointing out is that when the Palestinians began to become more and more separated from the larger Syrian community, and we'll talk about how that happens, you start to have the local clan leaders within this context becoming more and more pronounced. If you look at this picture of the Arab Higher Committee from 1936, in the lower left-hand corner, you can see a man in a black hat and a white suit, and next to him is a man in a white hat with a black suit. The first one on the left is Raghab Nashashibi from the Nashashibi family, and the other one is Amin al-Husseini from the al-Husseini family. And these 2 individuals were the patriarchs of their respective clans, 2 very different political opinions on how to achieve what would be a Palestinian unity, a Palestinian project. Raghib Nashashibi was in the perspective that Palestine should become independent of the British and remove the Zionists through negotiation. And Amin al-Husseini believed that it should be done through violence. And so those 2 opinions really fractured any kind of effective Palestinian unity that could have developed in the British mandatory period, and results in Palestinianism really coming as a result in a full and complete sense, a full Palestinian identity, only after the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, which we'll probably talk about next week. I also wanted to just sort of address that Jews were a huge part of the Ottoman power structure. If you look at this picture, there's the man in the white shirt, and just to his right, there's a man in a black shirt. That man is Emanuel Carasso, who was a Jewish member of the Young Turk Party, who was involved in the counter revolution of 1909. So it was a pro-revolution revolution against the counter-revolution. So that's counter revolution. But he was involved in telling Sultan Abdulhamid II to abdicate in favor of the Young Turk Party, along with other Muslim individuals like Arif Hekmet Pasha, Isad Pasha, Toptani, Aram Effendi, and Galip Bey. We talked about World War I ad nauseum in this group, but it just keeps coming back because of how important it is, and of course relevant for us in large part is the Palestine campaign as well as the Arab Revolt. So if we remember, in the beginning of the war, Ahmed Jamal Pasha, who is the governor of the Levant region, leads an invasion across the Suez Canal into Egypt, which is British occupied. And he is able to take the territory up to El Arish. You can see on the map he advances from the red line to the sort of the green dotted line, trying to get to the Suez. The British repel this attack using a combination of Indian and English troops. You can see the Hertfordshire Yeomanry and the Bikaner Camel Corps, Bikaner being a region in India. And so after this raid on the Suez, by and large, this region stays It's sort of in a holding pattern. And the British, in order to facilitate a change in status, begin to reach out to the Arab leaders. And so McMahon reaches out to Sharif Hussein, arguing that he would create an Arab state. Now, when he does that in this correspondence from 1915, he says, the districts of Mersina and Alexandretta and portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Hama, Homs, and Aleppo cannot be said to be purely Arab and excluded from the proposed limits and boundaries. Now, you can see on the map on the right-hand side what in theory that territory would be if it were strictly boxed in. But you can also see that the mandate of Palestine, which would come in the future, is also west of that. So the British have argued, somewhat unsuccessfully, depending on your perspective, that the line extends further south and would include the land of Israel or Palestine. And others argue that no, it's strictly that box, and therefore the area of the mandate of Palestine was promised to the Arabs. So as we mentioned in several of the other presentations, this outreach leads to an Arab revolt starting in the city of Mecca, where Sharif Hussein is based. But his force is so small that the Ottoman contingent is able to hold him off from taking Medina. Now, the Ottoman contingent isn't large enough, and the Ottomans can't spare any more troops because of their fights against the Russians and the British in the north. The Ottomans are able to hold Medina, but they can't advance out of it. So the revolt is sort of in a standstill. That said, the British the British continue to facilitate their alliances with the Sharif of Mecca and his clan. You can see here, this is T.E. Lawrence with his eldest son, Emir Abdullah, talking about future strategy in 1920, because that was the point where they were dividing the Middle East. And of course, we all know the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This is the agreement where the French and the British decide that they're going to chop up the Middle East and change zones of influence. And in this, the British argue that they should be given a zone that would reflect their interest in Palestine and Jordan. Their interest in Palestine was primarily from the fact that many in the British military were Christians from either Christian Zionists or British Israelites, and so, or just strongly religious, and so they thought that Britain holding this would be a jewel in the crown from an ideological perspective. Now, during the war, for the most part, that territory was ruled over by Ahmed Jamal. However, at the beginning, Baha'u'ddin Shakir was the governor, and he was not friendly to the Zionist populations that had already settled from the first, second, and third aliyot that we already discussed. And so he orders many members of the Shuv to be deported, especially from the main cities. And he makes a number of laws based on the fact that most residents of the Yishuv are not Ottoman citizens. They're citizens of the foreign countries in which they were born. And that's how he's able to segregate them from the Arab population. But these attacks and pogroms are seen as such a big problem that Jews within the Ottoman government, like Emanuel Carasso, and members of the Zionist movement outside of the Ottoman Empire, trying to curry favor with the Ottomans, request that this be changed. So Baha'u'ddin Shakir is removed from his post in the southern Levant. He becomes part of northern internal policy in the Ottoman Empire. And instead, Ahmed Jamal takes a direct hand in the running of the territory. That said, Ahmed Jamal didn't preside over a much better situation himself. In 1916, there was a massive locust plague throughout the Levant region, leading to numerous deaths. And without the ability of the Ottoman Empire to compensate, you ended up with large-scale famines. The biggest famine, of course, was in Lebanon, which we discussed, but it was not much better in Palestine. And so it's worth pointing out, because you can see Alfred Nussig with Talat al-Enver, the Zionists were trying to maintain good relations with the Ottoman Empire, and they were willing to to help them monetarily. From the position of the Ottoman Empire, courting the Jews was important for their public policy image because they wanted to point out that there was no genocide against the Armenians, right? So the argument was that their good treatment of Jews showed that the Ottoman Empire was a temperate government, and that their forcible removal of Armenians from sensitive regions was a result of military necessity, not a intent to remove that population. Now, you start to develop among the Jews a desire to fight alongside the British, holding that the British would probably be a better bet in proposing the creation of a Zionist state than the Ottomans would be, given how resistant Abdul Hamid II had been. You end up having the creation of what's called the Zion Mule Corps by two former Russian soldiers, Zev Jabotinsky and Joseph Trumpeldor. Trumpeldor himself was a war hero from the Russo-Japanese War. He had lost one of his arms in combat with the Japanese, but he remained a formidable soldier and continued to fight, saying, "I still have one arm." When he was arrested by the Japanese, he managed to work with a number of other Jewish soldiers and created a Zionist newspaper within the confines of the prison. In fact, it's believed that his embrace of Zionism as a political philosophy came during his detention by the Japanese. And the Japanese were actually very willing to support, at least by turning a blind eye, to the publication of Zionist newspapers, of religious festivals. The Japanese harbored very minimal anti-Semitism, and they saw this as part of Jewish religious observance. Zev Jabotinsky, or known by his birth name Vladimir Jabotinsky, was a person who approached the military creation as the primary form of Jewish emancipation, that Jews would be able to achieve victory and the creation of their nation if they actually fought and in order to create it. And so that was sort of his impetus. And we're going to see a lot more of Jabotinsky and his philosophy as we move through. But regardless, they created this group, and Jabotinsky, an ardent Anglophile, reached out to the British, hoping to have his Zion Mule Corps instated as a British division. And after a few years it became the Jewish Legion. And the Jewish Legion was sent to Gallipoli, where they fought the majority of the war against the Turks. But they were also involved to a lesser degree in the invasions of Palestine that would be led by General Allenby, which you can see here. Allenby was able to finally break the stalemate that had persisted since 1914 and take city after city. Allenby was a particularly pious Christian who knew his Bible very well, and because of his knowledge of the Bible, he actually recognized the names of places in Palestine, and would actually turn to the biblical verses that would describe the biblical battles in those places and use some of the tactics from the Bible in order to approach the Ottoman positions unawares, find secret routes. And part of that was the reason for his victory. Another part was that he had managed to put together the first large-scale expeditionary force, large-scale, relatively speaking. Remember, this is the Middle East, not Europe. So World War I in the Middle East is smaller in size. But the Egyptian expeditionary force, thrown together from mostly New Zealanders, Indians, and the Jewish Legion, was able to effectively move north through Palestine, and they were accompanied sort of on the eastern flank by the Sharif of Mecca's Arab forces. There's a question of whether the Zion Mule Corps could have been an inspiration for the Inglorious Bastards. I don't know if that's really the case. I think probably the real life, the inspiration would probably be more something like the Irgun or the Lachi, which we'll probably talk about next time. So, and of course, we have to talk about the most famous sentence in the history of the Israel-Palestine argument, which is the Balfour Declaration. And this is literally the whole thing. It fits right on one piece of paper, and it was issued by Arthur James Balfour, who was in his capacity as the Foreign Secretary of Her Majesty's government. Now, his view was compelled by a number of different things, and it's questionable which ones are more important or not. Balfour himself was a Christian. Balfour himself was a Christian, and within the foreign department, there was a vote actually as to whether or not they should approve or not approve this declaration before issuing it. The one Jew on the committee voted against it. All the Christians on the committee voted for it. And the argument was that a number of wealthy Jews, like Chaim Weizmann, who was a chemist within the UK, and Lord Rothschild, who is the one being addressed here, were more likely to support the British with the war bonds if he issued this. And the other point is that because of leaders like Zev Jabotinsky, the possibility of having a Jewish group that would be more British aligned than the local Arab peasantry was also appealing. So you get to Versailles and you divide the territory between the two groups. And as we talked about, the British get Palestine. And so what ends up happening is that the Allied authorities, while the Treaty of Versailles is being negotiated, have to actually occupy the region. So they divide it as occupation of enemy territory, the OETA, the Occupied Enemy Territory Administration. And they divide the region into a north, a west, a south, and an east. As we talked about in the Turkish War of Independence, most of the north becomes part of the modern state of Turkey as a result of that war, and so it sort of falls out of the occupied territorial administration. So there's a question of whether the Balfour Declaration was entirely cynical. I don't think there may have been some who thought that Jews deserve a country, but I think by and large the considerations behind the Balfour Declaration were from a money and strategic perspective more than any humanitarian claim. But as I was saying, the occupied territorial administration were divided between the north, the west, the south, and the east. And these regions were subject to a lot of questions about how exactly they would be divided. Now, one of the things that's very interesting is that at this point, the Americans are under the government of Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson is very interested in the idea of self-determination and nationalism for the various peoples. And so he does a survey called the King-Crane Commission, because he sends two American diplomats, King and Crane, to over 36 cities throughout the Levant region, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan today, and does a survey on the sizes of the population, its different ethnic groups, how and what their views were in terms of unification, mandates, colonization, and the rest of it. And the report is actually incredibly extensive. And the main point to take away from this is that when they did this, the majority of the population wanted to be in a unitary state called Syria. The one exception, of course, were the large Christian population in Lebanon that wanted some sort of autonomous region, as they had under the Ottomans. But by and large, they wanted unity. And of course, the smallest region in terms of population in this group was OETA South, which roughly corresponds with what will become the British Mandate for Palestine, a population of roughly 650,000 people. Now, OETA West, you can see, has around 1.3 million people, but most of that population is concentrated in the northern part of that. That's Damascus and Aleppo. Around 300,000 people live in what is today Jordan. So Jordan is even smaller It's about half the size of population of this OETA region, OETA South in this time. So the King Crane Commission publishes its findings, and like most government inquiries that actually analyze the situation and come to a clear and coherent result, the politicians in charge completely disregard it. And so you have the San Remo Conference, where the British and the French decide that they are going to divide the Middle East, and they divide it by assigning mandates to the various parts of it. And those mandates, as you can see, reflect to a certain degree the OETA zones, but not entirely. Now, the concept of a mandate was pioneered by Wilson and held the idea that these local populations should eventually have the ability to govern themselves. And the mandates were divided into Class A mandates, Class B mandates, and Class C mandates, depending on how, quote, ready, end quote, the population was for self-rule. Class A mandates should be ready for indigenous rule sooner, and Class C mandates practically never. And all the mandates in the Middle East were Class A. It was the mandates in Africa that were Class B, and the mandates in the Pacific, by and large, that were Class C. So, in theory, the colonial administrator should have been preparing these territories for self-governance. They should have been involving the local populations in administration and justice. And we're going to see some of that in Transjordan. We will see practically none of that in Palestine. So we have this territory south of Lebanon and Syria. It is a unitary territory, which the British are designated as the Mandate of Palestine, because the British get authorization for the creation of two mandates to match the French two mandates. So they create one mandate in Iraq, and they create one mandate in Palestine, which extends over both the countries today of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. And they appoint as High Commissioner the first Viscount Herbert Samuel. He was a Zionist Jew, and he was appointed specifically because the Zionist Jews who had been settling the region from the second, and third Aliyot continually objected to the various military commanders of the OETA that had been involved with mandating the territory, seeing them as too pro-Arab. Before that happens and the OETA is still being administered, you have a lot of debates about exactly where the division between the French mandate of Lebanon and Syria would be, and the northernmost reaches of the mandate of Palestine in the south. And as you can see, the border of OETA South doesn't exactly match the border of Israel/Palestine with Lebanon. And you can see that border in the yellow dotted line, slightly north of where the rest of the territory is. And so part of that region that was part of OETA West, but would become part of Palestine, was the kibbutz of Tel Chai. Tel Chai, in particular, was an area where both French and Arab resistors continually tried to hide from the other, because the Arabs were at war with the French. We talked about the Franco-Syrian War and the Battle of Maysalun in a greater degree, and we'll address it again today. Address it again next week. But because of this, you had Arabs who were fleeing from that war. They were fleeing French who were trying to hunt them down, and conversely, French who were trying to flee from the conflict, and Arabs who were trying to hunt them down. And Tel Chai had served as sort of a way station because it was controlled by Zionist Jews that was completely neutral in that conflict. On this day, the 1st of March, 1920, at Tel Chai, Shiite Arabs from Lebanon came to try and figure out whether or not French were hiding there, and this kibbutz population permitted them to come in and search. While they were in, the kibbutz population signaled to the nearby areas for Zionist Jews to gather in case they might need to resist those Arabs if the situation were to turn violent. It's unclear why the situation eventually did turn violent, but it did, and the riot resulted in the deaths of several Jews and several Arabs. One of those Jews was that one-armed Joseph Trumpeldor, who has become an inspiration to many Israelis in his death as well as in his life, with this memorial that you can see there. Tel Hai doesn't exist anymore. The population was absorbed after the war, the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, into Kfar Giladi, which is slightly to the south. Now, this territory would eventually become part of mandatory Palestine and now is part of Israel. But at the time, its disputed status was quite clearly, quite clearly something that could be understood because of the paucity of the borders and the unclarity of the situation. You then began to have, increasingly, as the San Remo conference, as the British and the French were consolidating their authority and the war was going on between France and Syria, you had in Palestine, outside of Jerusalem, the Nebi Musa riots, or the Prophet Moses riots. These riots were led by Arabs who were in opposition both to Zionism and the British occupation, and it resulted in Arabs attacking the Jewish population. There were a few deaths, and the police, descended on the Arab mob within a few days. But the Nebi Musa riots changed the relationship fundamentally between the Arab population and the Jewish population, because it set both sides against each other in terms of their factional allegiances relative to the British and relative to the process of the mandate, because now the mandate had the goal of facilitating a Jewish national home. And it's worth taking a second to talk about this term, Jewish national home. There was a debate in the Foreign Office and the British government as to whether or not they should endorse the creation of a polity, or they should or discuss a national home. And a national home had some degree of autonomy to it, but doesn't necessarily mean that the Jews would be independent. Most Zionists were not in the interest of having an autonomous Jewish region. They wanted a Jewish polity. And so they would increasingly push for high commissioners who would see it their way, and increasingly allow Jews to create the political apparatus that they would need in order to create a state. It seems like we're at the end of time for today, so I'm going to open it up for questions, comments, clarifications. And while we're waiting for those to pour in, I'm going to discuss what we are. Oh, by the way, we will continue with this next week, the second half of where I guess the rubber hits the road and we start seeing actual interactions between Zionists and the population, the indigenous population. Not to say the Jews aren't indigenous, but the Zionist wave is coming primarily from Europe, and it's going to increase in size, scale, and scope. All right, so you have just been part of my Middle Eastern Islamic history series, and we meet every Thursday at 7 p.m. As I said, next week we're going to be finishing up this story, and then the following week we are going to discuss the Mandate of Iraq and what that looked like in the same period. We also have groups that discuss Greco-Roman civilization. We have an Asian philosophy and Greco-Roman philosophy class hosted by Jason Peng. The Asian philosophy class, I believe, is ongoing every Saturday night. I think the Greco-Roman philosophy class might have paused for a bit. Aaron and I are doing a presentation on European Union security at 11 a.m. this Sunday. Usually it's at 2, but this Sunday we're doing it at 11. And we will discuss the security situation in Europe, and given what's going on there now, the lead up to that in the 90s is really critical for understanding why the response, especially from France and Germany right now, is so lackluster. We have a series that goes on once a month about Powerful Women by Jane Prendergast. We've done Dead Languages. John Maloney just did his 4th presentation on Ugaritic, and so we'll probably see something from him after Thanksgiving. And we have a number of short-run series, like our series on the Russo-Ukrainian War, which will probably reconvene sometime in January or February. to discuss any changes that have occurred since now, and back to the questions. So,
Richard, I just wanted to ask you, I didn't hear you precisely when you answered my question about Disraeli. I didn't hear what your answer was.
I don't know for certain that it was about him, but it sounds like exactly the kind of thing that would be said about him.
That's what I thought. I can't even remember who supposedly said it, but it wasn't intended kindly, obviously.
No, well, no, I mean, Disraeli took it in stride. I think one of the things that a lot of Americans don't really know about British politics, unless you've actually lived it, is that British politics is very confrontational. American politics tends not to be confrontational. We have our politicians give speeches, and politicians who disagree just sort of ignore them and then give their own speeches. British politics is very combative, where people actually just talk to each other, and they'll say, like, right honorable chairman, is it true that you are completely incompetent at your job? So like you'll have this sort of situation, and so they develop this sort of thick skin and witty banter that goes along with it. So Disraeli gave as good as he got. He would he was famous for saying things like, while my people were building civilization, your people were building huts. So you have this tete-a-tete going, and he said things that by our lights would sound very racist, just as the people that were addressing him were saying things that would sound very racist. And he was promoting this the view that he was a Semitic person, whatever that means from a racial context. Because he was an ethnic Jew, he was a believing Anglican from all appearances. He went to church. He seemed to do all the rituals, but he was a Jew by ancestry, and he walked into it as opposed to trying to run from it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there's sort of a question as to whether there should be a summary slide. I guess in summation, we have several different trends forming. The first one is that we have the slow development of an Arab identity for the population that's living in the region already. And that includes Jews. Those Jews are what's called the Old Yishuv, or the old inhabitation. And this population is sees themselves as Levantine Arab, but not specifically Palestinian. They're moving in that direction, but they haven't quite achieved a national consciousness that is a distinct national consciousness yet. And we're going to see that develop much more next week. By and large, they see the Ottoman government as being, in the early period, as being accepting of their uniqueness and their ability to self-rule. The later Ottoman government not accepting that, and the European governments certainly not accepting that. From the new Yishuv or Zionist perspective, we've seen a transformation of a return to the land of Israel existing only in a theological context, only in a religious context, and only upon the end of days, however that's understood, to a secular context of nation building by individuals who themselves are not religious. Joseph Trumpeldor, Zev Jabotinsky, Theodor Herzl, these individuals don't know anything about religious Judaism. I mean, we're talking, they had to read books while on campaign to figure out what they should do to celebrate Shabbat if they encountered religious Jews. So like they are not in this sort of religious Jewish sphere, but they're operating based on nationalism. And if you're curious about ethnic nationalism and how that develops, I encourage either watching episode 28 of this series or the Yugoslav discussion on nationalism. But the Zionists are beginning to hold together and argue that they need, one, a military prong to create this political entity, and they need a diplomatic prong to create this entity. So they're moving in both directions, and we saw that with the creation of the Zion Mule Corps, which eventually becomes the British Legion, trying to create that military piece of creating trained Jewish soldiers. And they're moving in the political piece through people like Chaim Weizmann and Rothschild and Louis Brandeis to convince politicians of the day that supporting a Zionist entity is something that's important. There's a point made in the comments that somebody spent time on a kibbutz, one of them that was developed during the Second Aliyah. That's fantastic and very interesting. Aaron, you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd like you to maybe discuss this dynamic, which definitely from the 19th to the 20th century, you wind up having this shift in, let's call it religious ethno-consciousness to more ethno-nationalist consciousness, and which shifts how narratives are really defined in people's wherever they might be in the world, but especially given this conflict that that's continuous, and the fact that you have basically large-scale migrations. You've always had large-scale migrations. I mean, there's nothing unique about that, however terrible they've been caused, or whatever generated them, but that you had new narratives built off of those migrations and the conflicts within, which in the past, 100-300 years ago, would be defined much more in a religious-centric way, and now in the modern world is defined much more in a national, and then secondarily religious or ethno structure.
Centric way.
Yeah, exactly, centric way.
It's actually one of the things, because a lot of people assume, because the Jews identify as a people, as a nation, even from their earliest religious discussions, that they had this sort of political bent to them, and that's simply not the case. That was something that developed through this nationalism. Patty, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, Aaron reminded me of a question that I had when you were talking about this early development of Zionism and who was sort of supporting it and who wasn't. What was the relationship of the time period when, I don't think this was always the case, but I think at a certain point, a lot of the Christian religions started this idea that that the Jewish nation, the Israeli nation, had to be restored before the second coming could happen. Was there any proximity of that becoming a widespread certainty with that development of the Zionist movement, or with support of it?
Well, I mean, we talked about, right, the British, the Christian Zionists that existed in the UK. That was sort of in our proto-Zionism discussion. And when you had people like Rothschild addressing the foreign ministry, asking for the recognition of Zionism, and I pointed out how there was a vote in the British foreign ministry, most of the Christians who voted in favor, there were other Christians who voted in favor who weren't affiliated, but most of the Christians who voted in favor were Christian Zionists or British Israelites. So these were individuals who felt that Zionism was the realization from a Christian standpoint of the end of days, right? That this was something that would lead to that cultural, that religious outcome that the Christians wanted. And in fact, many of them would also send missionaries to Mandatory Palestine, right, in order to try and convert the population to Christianity. That went swimmingly. So it's the one thing that the Jews and the Muslim Arabs could agree upon, and even the Christian Arabs were like, we don't want to be Protestant. We're quite happy being Orthodox.
Yeah, so, I guess part of what I'm asking is I don't know exactly when that.
Right. No, I'm working through the timeline.
Okay.
So what ends up happening is that you sort of have a divide within world Christianities on the subject of Zionism. You have evangelical movements that develop and incorporate this Christian Zionist doctrine, which is quite common among American evangelical movements and British evangelical movements. Outside of the Anglophone context, though, you don't really see Christians identifying with Zionism. And one of the things that we're going to touch on as we move through the presentation is that Christians in the Middle East are overwhelmingly anti-Zionist. And they see Zionism as something that ruined their relationship with the Muslim population and ruined the possibility of Syria, right? We talked about how the Syrian nationalists, Boutros al-Bustani, Anton Saadeh, we could talk about ones in the Palestinian context like Konstantin Zoreik or George Habash, uniformly are pro Bilad Hashem, Greater Syria, and they're not in favor of a Jewish polity, even interacting with that. So the view is popular in the United States. It's not popular outside of the United States and the larger Anglophone world.
Well, I will say one thing is that given the degree of basically Christian revolution in Europe, it's really sort of the easiest way to view it, over nearly 1,000 years, you wound up having a far more extreme view of tribulation, rapture, a sense of,
The whole Armageddon thing.
Yeah, Armageddon, which makes sense, right? Anytime you, especially you get 1,000-year religious war, which we don't sort of view that anymore, right? Whereas we view sort of Shia Sunnis as having that today. But if you're being objective, you could sort of look at this till really, I'd say the 19th century almost. You had a pretty solid 1,000-year run of that could compete all day long with the Shias and Sunnis, if not, win the Super Bowl of religious, intersectional war. And so the reason that's important is that if you look sort of biblically at the key passages that those believers that, given Armageddon viewed, you're looking at some pretty important passages. And in terms of the purpose of tribulation in relation to Israel and the conversion of the Jewish remnant, and so you're talking about Zechariah, you're talking about Ezekiel. I mean, you have some very strong, important passages that sort of, you almost want to think of it as configure the state before that rapture. And when you're emphasizing that, last days, because your group in Europe at whatever century in the second millennia is under, direct or indirect assault because of, Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the breakup of the British Church, Henry V and Henry VIII and all the Hanks basically, and you wind up having a population, which, by the way, migrated here too to the United States.
Yes.
And so there's a continuity to some degree in that belief.
But here's my sense, Aaron. My sense, which may be wrong, is that kind of view, that whole rapture and Armageddon thing, was not as set in stone until much later. I think, there were quite a few centuries that went by before that became such a
I mean, I would think that's fair, but to the earlier point of when nationalism, the concept of nation state, became dominant over religious or ethno-religious state. So to me, it's almost like it's an evolution. There's sort of an evolution in that belief of rapture that also configures itself to the evolution of modern nation states. And so when
but especially among American Christians, that is what the rabid identification with the nation of Israel is. So I'm just curious as to when that became such a fixation.
I mean, so I think it's relative fixation. I mean, if you look at, in the United States, we've had really rapture movements going all the way back to the
19th century, anyway.
16th, 15th, 16th,
16th, really, yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, Salem witch trials. I mean, it's you could go back pretty far.
Yeah, but that wasn't so much end of days. That was like keeping the devil out of the community. That it wasn't the same thing.
Well, I mean, I think we might differ in that you had more radical belief systems in American. You had less uniform, less large denomination belief systems in many parts of American Christianity going back very far. And so in our history, I mean, pre-revolution. And so I think when you marry that to this modernity where American, power can become more global, and at the same time, you have the big wars and you have the events of the first half of the 20th century across the Middle East and with Jews in Europe, and is that it almost creates this funnel effect that, I almost view it, nothing's inevitable in history, it's not deterministic, but that there was a moment where that like match struck, and that match.
Yeah, and that's what I'm kind of identifying. I don't know, maybe Richard, that might be something you might be able to tell us more about next week.
Sorry, the development of Christianity, or?
Well, not the development of Christianity, but my sense is that fixation with this end times and Armageddon thing.
It's not uniquely American, just so
No, I know, but I'm saying that's what I mean. Across Christianity, I don't think it was always there. I think that became a fixation much later.
It comes in waves.
I'm
not an expert in Christian history, but millenarianism in any that's the term for it. It occurs in any faith. There was a whole issue, for example, in Iran around the year 1840, which they believed would be the end times, and that's why you have the Baha'i movement coming into existence around that point. You have
same thing in America. That's when you had, and that became the Seventh-day Adventists. So that's my awareness of it happening is more around the 19th century.
Well, I think one thing we have to recognize is that whenever there's been a substantial transformation in any society, you're
going to see religious reflecting that.
Yeah, exactly. Whoever the mainline religions are, whether it's Japan, whether it, Shintoism in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, whether it's Christians across Europe or in the Americas or Jews, doesn't matter really, or Muslims, you're going to have a hardening typically because you don't have answers for this transformation that might be occurring, whether it's political, economic, security, cultural. You name it, all the different variables.
Yeah, but this is more of an obsession that, I'm
actually with Aaron here. You see it in the politics as well.
Yes.
Like when people believe that society is going well, permissiveness generally increases. And moderation usually increases to reflect that permissiveness. And then one of the easiest ways when times get difficult is for religious leaders to say, see, we gave all that permissiveness. We allowed for all that permissiveness. That is a sin for insert whatever reason. Yeah. And therefore, if we change, we can end the harshness, as opposed to saying a much harder thing to say, which is, we're industrializing. A lot of you on the farms will lose your jobs.
That's right.
Because we can replicate that. And you'll have to move into cities, and that's something you don't know, and that's something you don't understand. Because that higher minded message of this is a system that is organized and we will get you through it is a much harder message to tell and a much harder message to sell than the message of people in society have done the wrong thing. You can be the counterbalance that does the right thing, and the right thing conveniently is in a book that was written 2,000 years ago, so you don't have to look far for the answers.
Yeah, and a great example of this is you look not today, but you look at Russian Orthodox Christianity in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and it had extremely strident messages, biblical level messages that were like old school Old Testament level messages because of the conflicts. And then you look at someone like Tolstoy, who wrote Kingdom of God is Within You, which is basically the creation of Christian anarchism, because he's trying to separate the church and the state, and this sense of sort of a unity of purpose, that you can be your own sort of Christian and still be Orthodox. And you don't have to believe in sort of the rapture and the fire and brimstone. You can be really in some ways more existential.
I guess what I'm saying is that it seems to me that within the last 40 or 50 years, are you familiar with that series of books, the Left Behind series? I mean, that's fairly recent. I would say 40 or 50 years.
Yeah, but it's not actually, because if you look at the highest point of spiritualism in the United States was post-Civil War.
I'm not talking about spiritualism. I am talking about the specific obsession.
Right.
This
You
comes from spiritualism, Patty.
have to realize the economic transition that we're going through at this moment, right? We're going through a transition where nobody in the political world is addressing the transition that we're going through, and it's an automated. And like the only person who was Andrew Yang, my personal hero, and the laughing stock of apparently everybody else on this group. In offline conversations. So, but he addressed this issue that automation is happening. People are losing their jobs throughout industries. Most Americans don't believe they will have a life as good as their parents have had a life. They don't believe they'll be able to afford a home. They don't believe that they'll be able to work to a high position within a company. They don't believe that they'll be able to have a family. And when people are in that sort of situation, and they don't feel like anybody in a powerful position is willing to help, then the appeal of a religious end or a religious certainty becomes a lot more codified.
Well, this Left Behind thing was popularized by boomers, not by young people. Well, we were younger then.
But Patty, if you look at the pamphlets of basically the rapture spiritualism of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s.
No, I am familiar with that. I'm talking about the current, though. The current.
No, I get it, but I mean, it's like we cherry pick right now as the worst day in the history of the species, like it was invented Monday, and in reality, you can draw a string back, to reoccurrent cycles of similar movements, and I do believe there's a pretty substantial connection to it. So a great example is, if you think today is a challenge to spiritualism, compare the second half of the 19th century when the combination of scientific discoveries, archaeology, really everything rocked the foundation of all of the belief system that people had. That was orders of magnitude.
And would you say Christian nationalism was as intense then as it is now?
I mean, nationalism as a concept is different, but I would say
Christian nationalism, which is extremely powerful now.
But I mean, it's like we're predisposing nationalism's different if it's Christian versus any religious form of nationalism, which is
Christian nationalism is the dominant here in the U.S.
Yes, and so Shinto nationalism
I would say
Japan.
I would say that the political bent, because a lot of Christian awakenings in the United States were apolitical or indirectly political.
Yeah, exactly.
Like they would inspire other leaders who would themselves consider themselves aligned with the movement, but not part of the movement. The movement of Richard Falwell and modern evangelicals in the 1970s and 80s and Pat Robertson, like this is an intentional movement to gain politics and involved politicians. So it's a different incarnation, but it's the same phenomenon. Anyway, back to the subject that we actually came here to discuss.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take you. I'm just really curious because have you ever read that book, The Pledge, Richard?
No.
I think I'm thinking that it basically was, I'm pretty sure I get the right book. It was basically the story of all of the different ways that the U.S. and different groups in the U.S. really helped supply Israel leading up to 1948. And there was, that I understood, some religious element to that. There was also a lot of guilt related to that. But it was not the same as what I've seen develop in my lifetime in the last 40 to 45 years.
No. The religious side of 1948 was primarily from the Jewish community, not from the Christian community. You have to realize that the relationship of Christian Zionism in the United States was part of the growth of evangelicalism in the 60s and 70s. I have a comment here that two points: that Weizmann was not particularly rich, which is but that he was a chemist the British badly needed. But it's not that Weizmann himself was rich or not. It's the point that he had access to a lot of wealthy Jews, and he was a very gifted rhetorician. So getting Weizmann on the side of the British, first of all, meant that the chemicals that he was producing would be available, but also meant that he would be able to help the British sweet talk a lot of these loan officers. So that was part of the relationship there. And the second point is that that Israel became a lot more capitalist after the Yom Kippur War. That is absolutely true. If you go to presentations that I made on the history of Zionism that are 6 hours long, for those of you who really want the whole thing, they are there on our group website under the Jewish history section, and there are 2 3-hour presentations that get us the entire way through Zionism without touching the Palestinian side, and that's why some of the slides in this presentation are blue and some of the ones are sort of sand colored. The blue ones are from the Zionist presentation, and the sand-colored ones are from this particular presentation. And that way, and for me, it also preserved sort of a sense of like the Zionists operating sort of in a different context from the Middle East until they hit the ground and they start operating in that context.
And one other quick point I wanted to make is that, I think there's a strong correlation in terms of example of Shinto nationalism in Japan as Christian nationalism is in the United States. And
yeah, I was going to say, Casper left a comment saying that there's a lot of pagan nationalists, and Shinto nationalists are a perfect example of that.
Exactly.
Yes, but I would say the group causing the most upheaval in the US right now would be Christian nationalism.
I mean,
yeah.
Maybe, but you just had a likely future prime minister basically killed in Japan, which is sort
right.
of
I'm not an expert in Japan, but I am fairly familiar with US history and political history. And I guess what I'm saying is a lot of the chaos going on now originates in Christian nationalism, particularly exploited beginning with the evangelical movement.
I mean, I think that's a broad debate given there's 350 million Americans. And so, the percentage that identify that way is.
They're not all being funded by the same people.
Anyway, so any final questions before we close this out?
No, but I appreciate all your time. Thank you both.
No, of course. So anyway, see you next week for When the Rubber Hits the Road, and we'll finish the story of mandatory Palestine. All right. See everybody next week.
Good night,
Bye.
all. Thank you.